You're listening to a podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation. To learn more, visit cac.org.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Everything Belongs podcast. I'm Mike Petrow. It's good to be joined by the one and only Mr. Paul Swanson. Paul, it is so good to see you.
So good to see you. And gosh, what a fun conversation this was with Richard and with Carmen later on. It's a joy to, I have to pinch myself. Like, we get to have these conversations on these incredible texts about these incredible themes. I can't believe it.
Yeah, it's so awesome. And just to remind our listeners, this season we're going through Richard's book, Eager to Love, The Alternative Way of Francis of Assisi. And what's amazing is you don't have to read the book with us to listen to the episodes because they're so rich and there's such good conversation. But if you want to, this week we're talking about Chapter 5, Contemplation, a different way of knowing. And it is so, so good. We get to talk to Carmen Acevedo Butcher, one of our favorite teachers and friends, and we get to go join Richard in his living room for an intimate chat about how contemplation came into his life and what it means to him now.
Yeah, and I felt like we went back to some like the baseboards of contemplation with Richard, talking about, bearing the image of God and what does it mean to grow in likeness. And we got into some Eastern Orthodox language around theosis and divinization, and what does that mean, and what does it mean for those of us today as we seek to live in this growing, expansive, participative scene? I feel like Richard the lights get a little bit brighter on conversations that have to do with contemplation because it's been such a lighthouse for him, something that's really been a North Star. What's your impression when you're in those conversations with Richard on contemplation?
Oh, man. I mean, I listen, first of all, I love it whenever Eastern Orthodoxy comes up because, that's been a love of mine for many years. And having just discovered that I'm actually Russian, which I didn't know, is super cool. It adds another dimension to it. But yeah, Richard just opens the door to a whole different way of understanding when he teaches about contemplation. I'd been interested in mysticism for so many years, and when I ran across Richard's teaching on contemplation, and I really understood that he was sort of giving us a way in to open our eyes to experiencing the mystical or the extraordinary in the ordinary. Goodness gracious, it changed my world. And never in a million years would I have guessed that I would get to sit down with yourself and Richard Rohr in his living room so often and let him practice contemplation right in front of us by seeing the divine shimmering out in everything around us and in all the things we talk about. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a huge gift, and I think it comes across in this conversation with Richard. And there's no better way for us to just throw it over to that conversation and give everyone a chance to join us in Richard's living room with the two of us and Richard and, of course, Opie at his feet or between us as we go into the myriad of ways of talking and experiencing and practicing contemplation.
Yeah, come on in, everybody. Paul and I are going to be squeezed onto a tiny little couch with Opie wagging his tail between us, and Richard's going to be leaning back on his recliner, just sharing the wisdom. So here we go. From the Center for Action and Contemplation, I'm Mike Petrow.
I'm Paul Swanson.
And this is Everything Belongs.
Richard, thanks again for inviting us into your hermitage to have this conversation on Chapter 5 of Eager to Love, Contemplation, a Different Way of Knowing. It's great to be back on this couch with Opie here, sitting between Mike and I, resting his eyes. And we've been eager to have this conversation on contemplation, knowing its roots and how deep it goes back into your lineage as a Franciscan. Of course, it goes further back than that, but that's how so much of this has come to be for you, is what you've learned from the Franciscans and how it's formed you. So it's a joy to be in conversation.
Yeah, Richard, I'm super curious. Contemplation has been a huge part of your life and teaching. Do you remember when you first learned about it? Was it in seminary as a Franciscan?
Not directly. we didn't use the word. In fact, with great irony, the novice pastor used the word mental prayer. And it meant the opposite. It meant getting out of your mind. But I think the reason he used it, was to distinguish it from verbal prayer, recited prayer, memorized prayers, which ironically is mostly what we did. But the key was we came to chapel early in the morning, and we had to spend a half an hour on our knees in silence. And that was mental prayer. It was really contemplation by another name. And ironically, without much clear teaching on how to do that, some of us fell into it because there was no teaching. The pre-Vatican II Catholic Church had lost in its main line the contemplative teaching. As you've heard me say in other places, Thomas Merton retrieved the word, but even he didn't teach the how, only the what. So we all came to idealize this word contemplation, but there were few teachers around to this day. It's so sad, who teach you how to do it in terms of letting go of your thinking, letting go of your need to say prayers, and the whole movement toward lifestyle, being a prayer, doing everything consciously with love. I think I call it in the book participative prayer. Yeah. Where you aren't the prayer. Someone else is praying in you, through you, with you, as you, and all you can do is let go and let it happen.
Yeah.
It's such good news because it lets loose of that whole notion of prayer as effortful.
Yeah.
Or willpower, or stay with it, grit your teeth and keep saying prayers. What a waste of time, because that still is emphasis upon me, Richard, doing the praying. Whereas just let the prayer loose inside of me and it will happen. I still think that way to this day.
I love, in the 3rd century, Origen wrote his famous book on prayer. And he looks at Paul. Paul says, pray without ceasing.
Yes.
And Origen says the only way we could ever really pray without ceasing is when we realize that all life is prayer. Every moment of being alive is a conversation with the divine.
Why that Origen?
Yeah.
He said it all.
Got
Well,
there first.
I love what you're describing, that I let prayer unfold in me. That's amazing. Do you think we see that in the life of Francis? Was that Francis' style of contemplation?
I think exactly so. And that's why he didn't need to chant psalms in a chapel. If you read his earliest lives, he's always wandering from one city to another by himself. If you think he lived in community, he's clearly like in a daze of gazing.
Oh, that's a good phrase.
And the daze continues wherever he goes.
Yeah.
I believe that now more than ever, having tried to understand his life all my life. He abides by the practice of the Benedictines, which is to say the whole office, which is 150 Psalms in the course of the week. But he doesn't draw his inspiration from that at all. His Bible is nature, where he is all the time. I don't think he recognized that his genius was intuitive. It wasn't didactically taught to him. And that's the reason a lot of us didn't get it from him, the direct teaching.
Yeah.
Maybe the direct teaching is impossible.
Well, I wonder, I think about Francis wandering the countryside. We talked about Francis preaching to birds. We'll get around to talking about Francis converting the wolf, which is one of my favorite stories. But you call this chapter a different way of knowing. And I assume that when it comes to Francis, it required a different way of teaching, right? If it's a different way of knowing, the transmission must be a little different. Does that sound right?
Yeah, the different way of teaching became relationship.
Ooh.
Walking 2 by 2. Even Shakespeare calls it walking like a friar, because we walked 2 by 2. It always taken those kind of things literally from Jesus, but then separating in a line, and that's what Shakespeare meant. You'd talk, but then you'd separate. One would walk 6 feet ahead of the other to just behold the mystery.
Yeah.
Which had become you, and you, the seer, all you are seeing is what you have become, what you are. Union, beautiful union.
Oh man, I love that image of seeing what you've become and what you are.
No, that's the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
God is the goodness of everything. Not just everything. That's what we call that a heresy. God is everything. What did we call that?
Pantheism.
Pantheism.
As opposed to panentheism, which is God is in everything.
But God is the goodness of everything.
Yeah.
That's where I'm at now. Why I can gaze on this porch for an hour and a half without getting bored. Just seeing the leaves in that tree. The goodness of those leaves is God.
It's a beautiful, beautiful image.
But it's the goodness of God in me that sees it.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I love that contemplation is a long, loving look at the real. And I don't think I've thought enough about the long, loving look at the real in the mirror, and seeing what I'm becoming or what's unfolding in me.
Yeah. And that was Claire's big metaphor, right? The mirror?
The mirror. She uses it again and again.
Any example of that come to mind as how she exercised contemplation with mirror?
She uses it so much, you know that she must have had a lot of what I'm going to call reflective experience. That what she saw was what she was what she passed on. The reflection bounced back and forth. There's no other reason she would have used the mirror image so much. And mirrors in the 13th century were very imperfect. They weren't the polished, clear mirrors we have now. They still had mirrors. I'm attracted to her use of the term precisely because she uses it so much. Even though, again, she doesn't really explain what does she mean by a mirror. You are a perfect mirror. What you see is what you are. And you have to stand in what you are, which she and Francis both knew was a beloved child of God. So to stand in your belovedness Did I say this here or somewhere else this week? I try to interpret that verse. Many are called, but few are chosen.
Oh, I haven't heard that.
Yeah, I don't,
That was to somebody else.
yeah,
Didn't that line always bother you?
yeah.
Yep.
I've never met a person who has given a satisfactory interpretation of that.
Yeah.
Well, now I'm going to give it to
Oh,
you.
boy.
Oh, here it comes.
What I think. Who cares what I think? But many are called. The many, we would say the masses. The masses are called. I think that's a better translation of it. But there's only a few who live inside the beloved status. It was him talking about the prophets who try to tell Israel they are the beloved of God. Those who stand inside of who choose that they are chosen, that's only a minority. But that's enough to hand on the message. Only it's the prophetic theme of the remnant. There's only a minority of people who choose that they are chosen. So the masses are called. Everybody, God's called everybody. That old guy walking across the parking lot, God's calling him. But I don't know how much he's enjoying it. The enjoyment of it is the few. That's my present interpretation of
Oh, I
that
like that a lot.
enigmatic line,
Yeah.
which makes sense to so few people. Many are called, but few are chosen. Because we make it into an elitism
Yeah.
again.
Right.
And it's not an elitism. It's just a description of the way it's playing out.
Yeah.
And the way it's playing out is there's so few who just enjoy the participative union that is total gift, not moral achievement. Not moral achievement.
Mm-hmm.
And that's at the heart of Franciscan contemplation. It's not moralistic. I'm going to use the word not to offend anybody. It's not Calvinistic.
Yeah.
And I really don't resent John Calvin. I just wish he understood the gospel. That is, it's known by participation with God, in God, not by achievement of teeth-gritting moral behavior.
Well, I love, this reminds me of, there's this idea that I love in the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition where they talk about theosis. This theosis is becoming Christ-like. And the idea is not we work hard to be good or we work hard to gain our salvation, although those are implicit in it. It's we're transforming. I know you can talk about that better than I can in regards to this book.
Well, this is a great segue. I'm wondering how this feels like it all connects together within this chapter, where you, and as an entry point for listeners or new readers to this book, where you bring us back to Genesis 1, about where you say, for most of us, this objective divine image that we're born with has not yet become the subjective likeness. Our goal is to illustrate both the image and likeness of God. So I think of that as enjoying that divine
Both
imprint.
image and likeness.
Image
Yes.
and likeness.
Very good.
And it seems to me that Francis and Claire go all in on this vocation, on this vocational deepening. They savor it, they recognize it, they gaze from it.
They enjoy the fruits of it.
They enjoy the fruits, and they grow in this likeness by what the gospel invites them, compels them to do. How does Francis and Claire's surrendering in this way speak to the radical expression of the contemplative way that they embodied and shared?
They couldn't have both spoken with such calm confidence. Do you ever watch this dog whisperer, Cesar Millan?
I remember, I've seen it before, but now,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those are his words for how you train a dog, and it always works, at least when he does it. You have to be calmly confident of who you are. And when you speak from that place of calm confidence, a dog knows it and will listen to you. When you speak from a place of insecurity, doubt, unsurety of what you really want, the dog knows that and shares in your anxiety. I think that's true. I think I've had to learn how to talk here with Opie with calm confidence. You two must too, because he's snuggled there between you, trusting both of you. Oh, you know we're talking about you, don't you? Calm confidence might be a better word for faith than believing the doctrines of the church.
Yeah.
I've had it with people who believe the doctrines of, that sounds terrible, but it's just a wrong definition of faith.
Isn't the root word of belief to wish? Like
What's the root word?
Isn't the root meaning to wish, like to wish? So like beliefs are in a sense almost like a wished for, where I feel like faith is leans into that calm confidence. It takes away some of the magical thinking that I hear in to wish for.
You know, you might be right. I don't know what source you're drawing upon.
I can't remember, so I need to be fact checked. But that's what I recall.
Yeah. Was it the Hebrew word or the Greek word?
I cannot recall for the life of me, but I remember reading it somewhere. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah. Oh, you're like me. You're getting like me already, forgetting things. Don't go there.
I'll check with our librarian.
Lee will know.
What's interesting, I'm thinking about just bring it all together. Again, right, this beautiful verse in Genesis where God says that he's created humanity in the image and likeness of God. And a lot of the early theologians and the Eastern Orthodox make a lot of this. They nuance that by saying all of us have the image of God. Everyone's created in the image of God. They inherit it. And then our task in life is to transform more and more into the likeness of God.
Yes.
To become more Christ-like, to become more loving. It's
so
interesting.
that others can feel the Christ presence.
Like emanating out of that calm confidence.
The line that comes to life for me is, I wonder if I was being obnoxious. But when my novice master said, Richard, you have to make it easier for people to love you. That's likeness.
Yeah.
You have to make it easier for people to love you.
Yeah.
Wow.
That is a life task right there.
Isn't it? Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, and it's interesting too. I think about what you're talking about, even in this, I love the phrase, was it the days of gazing? And as we look lovingly at the world, does that cause us to become more loving, right? In as our view of the world is transformed.
That's the reflecting of the mirror that Claire is talking about. As we gaze at it, it imprints, and that becomes our life stance. Just to be the beauty of that leaf hanging there for a few more weeks till fall comes, and then allowing itself to fall. Inherent dignity, so much so that it's willing to fall off the branch and die.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? It does to me.
Yeah. Sobering and profound.
And that inherent dignity that you're enjoying also makes it easy for you to fall off the branch in that final falling that we call death.
Yeah.
What's to be afraid of? someone has been loving me in all my ups and downs and half-hearted living of life, why would this God change his policy toward me? You know, when I go to the final death. And that is easy belief for me now. Yeah. I do think about death a lot. But I can definitely say I'm not afraid of it. If I heard that it was going to happen at 3 this afternoon, I wouldn't run somewhere and say a fervent prayer. Well, maybe I would. I don't know. But I don't feel like I would.
It's I had a Buddhist teacher who taught me
Maybe I
that,
should want to. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no. I had a Buddhist teacher who taught that practice was preparation for death, and not in a morbid sense of
No, not in an anxious sense.
but also in this notion that if death is rejoining being or whatever we come from, for us, if death is returning to the love from which we came, we will spend the majority of our existence in that state. So contemplation is just a preparation for stepping back into that.
Very good. Thank you.
A remembering too, in a way, right? A remembering to rejoin where we before we were born.
And now I just saw a little hummingbird flicker through 2 branches. You know, for the native peoples, there he is again. The hummingbird they didn't understand Holy Spirit the way we do, but that was their animal which spoke of the Spirit, the hummingbird, which just flickered around. I have a hummingbird feeder here, and I've been watching them a lot. They don't stay there drinking. They just shoot out and shoot back, and you find it hard to position them. I could see why the native peoples thought that was the Spirit, sort of moving quickly from here to there, and we can't capture him. You never have a hummingbird in a cage,
Right.
I don't think. Have you ever seen
I would hope not.
I don't think you
hummingbird in a
could.
cage?
That's a great story. I got chills thinking about it. I think last weekend hiking, and I was top of my hike. I got up in a tree, and a hummingbird came out and kind of got right in my face.
Did it really?
Yeah, it's great.
While you were up in the tree?
Yeah,
Wow.
Oh, that's beautiful.
yeah,
I'm glad I mentioned it.
yeah. I like to pray in trees on my hikes. Well, as we bring this conversation to a close, Richard, you've taught contemplation for over 50 years. You're more deeply engaged in the practice of gauging than you've ever been. What parting advice would you give our listeners for stepping into the type of seeing and being that you describe in this chapter?
Don't think of it as a duty or obligation. That distorts it. I have to pray to make God happy. You have to pray to make yourself content. That's different. To live in the already, in the now, in the enough. You have to pray, or you won't be content. I'm just grabbing for words.
I think that's so true. Always, like when we try to talk about prayer or contemplative practice, we grab for words because that's all we can do, right? Like we're trying to speak
That's
to
all we
something
can do.
about getting out of the way, surrendering, letting go of our agenda for what we think
Yes.
we want or hope for in
Yes.
participation in God, where it's just actually
Yeah.
releasing to enjoy it.
No definition will be adequate. It's like. Well, thank you for desiring such truth. I hope it's coming through on some level. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks for your quiet confidence.
Everything Belongs will continue in a moment.
What does it mean to embody salt and light? In 2025, Richard Rohr's daily meditations turn to Jesus' timeless metaphor for reflecting love into the world. Amid this season of uncertainty, join us in living with trust, being salt and light. For 18 years, the daily meditations have inspired thousands of readers like you. Subscribe today at cac.org/saltlight2025. That's cac.org/SALTLIGHT2025.
Hey everyone, welcome back. As we explore Chapter 5, our guest today is Carmen Acevedo Butcher. She's an author, teacher, poet, and award-winning translator of spiritual texts. Additionally, she is the senior lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley, in the college writing programs, and she is affiliate faculty here at the Center for Action and Contemplation. And we hope you enjoy this conversation that Mike and I have with Carmen Acevedo Butcher on Chapter 5. Carmen, welcome to Everything Belongs. We're so thrilled to have you here in conversation. There's so many things we could talk about, but we're going to try to harness our energy and our attention to talk about some themes around Chapter 5, Contemplation, a different way of knowing. How are you doing today, Carmen?
Oh, I'm great. Thank you, Paul. Mike, it's so good to be with y'all.
Oh, it's good to see you too, Carmen. It's always one of the highlights of my days when we get to talk. And it's good to see you too, Paul. I feel like it's been a hot second since we met together on the Everything Belongs podcast. And it's always...
I know, right?
Yeah. It's just when I get to hear that Swanson swoon, it just makes my heart skip a beat.
This is a lovely trio to be in conversation with. If I can applaud our own efforts here, is I always feel like I learn something when I'm in conversation with the two of you. You bring such unique perspectives and insight and wisdom. And just as kind of a starting place, Carmen, we would love to know, since the theme of this season is Eager to Love, Richard's book on Franciscan spirituality, do you remember the first time that you came across Francis or Claire or their communities? And if you do remember, what imprint do they make on you at that time?
The first time I really met Francis and Claire was in graduate school. And the main impression I got was, here are two people who feel about the earth the way I do. That was my initial impression. So I never had what Richard, I love how he refers to it as bird bath theology. I never had that. I just was like, wait, here are two people who are really respected in Christianity, and they're talking about earth, and really giving my experience with the earth much credence. Okay, this is somebody, it's not just my child heart, in other words.
Yeah. So in that initial recognition, have you noticed ways that it's your relationship to Francis and Claire and their spirituality has evolved from that first recognition of like a kinship around the love of Earth and the planet and the wild? How have you seen that evolve since that time?
Wow, I've never been asked that question, but I got goosebumps as you were asking it, Paul, because two of the ways are that the deepening was how they bring non-oppositional energy to trying to bring that love they experience of God in the earth to their society and to their worlds. And so I didn't notice that at first. It was more about, fellow earthlings, people who really appreciate ducks and egrets and ants and things, and the dirt like I do. But then when I saw that Francis and Claire, they're both so wise about not pushing back, but like the way he built the churches outside, the way he repaired and did things without pushing back. Because I grew up in a dynamic of the evangelical churches of the childhood that I spent being taken to those Southern Baptist churches, and it was all oppositional, energy. We're right, they're wrong, and that's not at all what Francis was about. He gave me new ways to think of how I could be love in my own environment and still have my boundaries at the same time.
I really appreciate that, Carmen. And I appreciate, I think one of the things that the three of us share, we've talked about this before on this podcast, is how we learn love from the more than human world. So, I always joke that my favorite apocryphal saying from St. Francis is preach the gospel and if necessary, use birds.
I haven't heard that.
I love how
that you're really winging it there, Mike.
Oh my God, that hurt me, and it was perfect. Good God.
I love that, really.
That was great, Carmen. Wow. But I love, we've all communed on this before, how we are following, I think, in the footsteps of Francis. We learn from our time in nature. And I know, Carmen, we share with you how much we feel it healing. I thought of you the other day. I was out hiking and got stuck in some pretty deep New Mexico mud, which is like glue, and I was up to my calves, and finally extricated myself and kicked up a black-tailed jackrabbit, which I've never seen before. They're huge. And, had kind of like the ravens and everybody around. And I immediately thought of you, Carmen. I was like, this is a moment that Carmen would appreciate. Yeah. How would you say something more, just for our listeners, in the spirit of Francis and Claire, how nature teaches you love?
Well, Richard says in this book, I think it's in a footnote, from The Immortal Diamond, he says all of his books are about humans enjoy an inherent God-given connection with God. He says that's what all my books are about. And this is in a footnote. So I always recommend reading Richard's footnotes. And for me, no matter the state of my life, I often like to think of what Jim says. But when I was a child, Jim says, if we are grounded in love, in the absolute love of God that protects us from nothing, even as it sustains us in all things, it grounds us to face all things with courage and tenderness. And this is why, when Richard says this is inherent connection, he even calls it later on in the chapter an ontological union. So in other words, we don't have to do anything but just be aware of it. And as a child, I often went out in nature to escape a loud and violent home. And out in nature, I found that ontological silence that Dr. B talks about, that union, and that Richard talks about. And I didn't have words for it, but I didn't need words for it. We try, and I've been guilty of this so much, but we try so hard. But even before I had words for this, and it did help me later to have some kind of words to describe these experiences, obviously. But as a child, I was held in nature. And the person I most relate to on this is Howard Thurman, where he talks about he would sit underneath the oak tree and unpack his heart, and he would take out the joys, the blessings, the requests, the angers. And so I grew up out in nature, speaking my heart to God and realizing without anybody telling me that I could say anything. And Brother Lawrence says, you would be surprised sometimes what happens in these brief conversations with God. I had nobody to tell me, oh, Carmen, you can't say that to God. And what I discovered is that God can take everything. Anything I would say to God was acceptable and accepted and heard, and I would learn things from it. And then sometimes it would be just sheer joy, Mike, Paul. So I remember one time, I don't remember the age I was, but maybe 12 or 13, and I went out to the pine woods behind our house, those tall loblolly pines of Georgia. And I may have even been burning trash earlier or something, but I went for a walk through the woods. And next thing I knew, I was swinging around one of the trees. and dancing. And when I got done, I was like, wow, what was that? And it felt so normal. I couldn't explain it, but at the same time, I knew this is me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think of a friend and teacher, I think that you and I share, Paul, in Belden Lane. And he wrote my all-time favorite book, The Solace of Fierce Landscapes, but he talks about this practice he's had of just praying with this one particular tree for years and years and years, just going to this one fidelity of place and space. And Carmen, I appreciate that, the liberatory experience of that.
Amen. And I feel like you tee up this next question, which is directly related to this chapter too, where the chapter, of course, is called Contemplation, a Different Way of Knowing. And we can go in a whole bevy of directions when it comes to contemplation, but I would love for us to define that term first. For you, Carmen, how do you define contemplation? How do you bring that word into your theological awareness, your lived experience, your practicality? How do you define contemplation?
Every time you would ask me this question, I would have a different definition, I think, because I'm always asking myself this question. But last night, I happened to be at Book Passages, and I was listening to Mirabai Starr talking about her book with Anne Lamott there, and she was saying, really, this book is about mysticism, which is putting on a new pair of glasses so you can see. And so for me, that's what it is putting on this new pair of glasses to remind me that I'm love, the world is love, God is love, which is so easy to forget. And, then of course I would supplement that by, with my obsession with the histories of words and such, which does support that, being like a temple within us where we can look out and see. But yeah, it's just a new pair of glasses. I love Mirabai Ann's definition.
Oh, that's so great. And I appreciate that because, this is a podcast where we talk about living the teachings of Richard Rohr Forward. And Richard really, really loves this theme of seeing. He talks about it in this chapter, the who's seeing, what are we seeing, what is seen. And I love when Richard defines contemplation as a long, loving look at the real. This idea of contemplation as a way of seeing seems to go way, way back, right? Prophets, oracles, and shamans were known as seers. We have this practice that you and I love, Carmen, the prayer of the heart from the ancient Christian contemplatives. And Origen says we sink our mind into our heart and look there for other eyes. We have the Jesus prayer, which I also know you, Carmen, and I have geeked out about together, but this prayer, Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, which comes from a story in the Gospels where a blind man says, Jesus Christ, Son of David, have mercy on me. He's asking for his eyes to be opened. So I have loved all the conversations we've had, Carmen, in the Living School and just in just our own, personal connection about prayer as seeing and prayer as paying attention. So I have to ask, you've translated The Cloud of Unknowing. You've translated Practicing the Presence by Brother Lawrence. I know you've recently translated something. I don't know if we're allowed to talk about it or not, but I know I'm excited about it. Can I share? Yes. I know you've been working on the Gospel of Thomas lately. What have translating these beautiful mystical texts taught you about seeing as contemplation?
Oh, wow. Y'all asking me questions are giving me goosebumps. And I just want to say I've so enjoyed our conversations in the Essentials, dialogues. It's been wonderful. So what it's taught me in one sentence is to be kinder to myself. Okay, but that has really been healing for me. When I translated The Cloud of Unknowing, it was, these people aren't dead at all to me. And when you read somebody's writing, you really get to know them better. It can be a first year's essay. It can be Brother Lawrence's writing, from the 1600s. It doesn't matter. Our writing is like a, fingerprint. And when I translated The Cloud, it was really me wanting to eat the cloud. And it was shadow work for me because I was really translating to escape my pain in some ways, on some level, because it's complex life. And I was also trying to find a way to find peace. And I just was pulled to the cloud because I just knew it could heal me. I didn't have words for that. And I really did a lot of contemplation. That's what it was for me. These translations are contemplation at the deepest level, along with Lectio Divina that I do every day. And so it was really intense. And then when I got to Brother Lawrence a few years down the road, as I started typing him up, I was like, oh, wow, I do this. I've prayed like this since a child. And it was a part of the gold in my shadow that I had never seen before, just because of trauma had hidden it from me. I was afraid to see it. I couldn't see it. And as I was able to embrace that during the pandemic days, I became so self-compassionate, which was new at that level, which was really new for me because I was used to being hard on myself. And I was like, oh, wow, it was better than dark chocolate, I like to say. It was just, I am just still to this day so grateful for that, One of the mystics, is it Mechtild of Magdeburg, or somebody says that, God may seem delayed, but God is always right on time. So I'm very grateful.
I can't help but wonder, and these are oversimplifications of texts that you're so intimately familiar with, but I always think of the cloud of unknowing in the terms of the stripping away of our ideas, our thoughts, our preconceived notions, maybe the scripts and the limitations that have been put on us. So we're unseeing in the cloud of unknowing. And then with Brother Lawrence, we're starting to see and experience the presence of God in the ordinary, in everything that's happening around us, moment by moment. Do you think these two go hand in hand? Do we need a stripping away first before we can see the divine right in front of us?
Oh, I really love that, actually. Yeah, I really love that. I don't think I can improve on that because that was really my experience with them. And then with Brother Lawrence going, okay, I already do this. Now just see that you do it. So that was really the key in the ordinary, so that contemplation can be answering emails or doing a report that I'm not particularly keen on doing. Like we all have reports in our lives we have to write or do, things like that. And finding this as a gift in some way. So yeah, Mike, and definitely, I remember I was reading Thomas Keating at the same time that I was translating The Cloud of Unknowing. And he kept saying, when you do these intense periods of contemplation, that it's really like you're moving junk out. And I don't know that I really like the term junk, it's more like unburdening, but really and truly that stripping that you're talking about, of letting go of the small ego concerns and letting go of the injuries even, and entrusting them to this healing love was really a stripping away. It was.
Well, you remind me, this is like a perfect trifecta. You remind me constantly of something that Jim says. So I get to talk to you, and then you, in your wisdom, remind me of something that another teacher that we love, Jim, says. When you say over and over again, what is it? Only love has the right to name who we truly are. And remembering that in seeing ourselves in contemplation. So there's a letting go of all those other scripts, all those other voices that want to tell us who we are. And then, am I saying that right? I know you say it all the time and I don't have it committed to memory.
Yeah, he says, only love has the power to name who we are. Yeah. That to me is a mantra, one of my mantras. And it's so true because, we grow up and like we might have a parent who tells us we're worthless, or we might have this notion that we've got to make all A's in school, but there's always some sort of somebody telling us these different sorts of things. And then the difficulty becomes that we internalize these things and then we tell it to ourselves, which is the worst thing to really, get healing with. But yeah, only love has the power to name who we are. It's like, it's like that hallelujah chorus. If you've ever, it's like hearing that burst open in your mind and thinking, yeah, that's it. I'm not going to settle for anything less, because that's the promise.
Well, and what a gift, what an invitation to, this long, loving look at the real, to see love in reality in birds and trees and the people around us, but also in ourselves. Actually, if y'all would take a journey with me for a second, I have one of my, that I love Carl Jung. Something that I find absolutely fascinating is there was a quote I had read from him early, and I was very curious about what he meant by it. And I'm starting to think he's referring to contemplation. Here's what it is. He's talking about a way of seeing the world that he thinks that Christianity lost. And so this is what he writes. Christianity must indeed begin again from the very beginning if it's to meet its high educative task. So long as religion is only faith in outward form and not experienced in our own souls, nothing of any importance has happened. The person who doesn't know this from their own experience could even be a learned theologian, but they would still have no idea of religion or education. Even theologians could fail to see that it's not a matter of proving the existence of the light, but of people who don't know that their eyes could see. It's high time we realize it's pointless to praise the light and preach it if nobody can see it. It's much more needful to teach people the art of seeing. And this reminds me of something that Richard said. Carmen, you've worked with us in the Living School. Paul, you were one of the early architects of the Living School. And I ran across this statement recently, Richard talking about the Living School. And he says, that's spiritual seeing, teaching you how to be contemplative and see the sacred in everything, all the time, everywhere. So you see why at our school and at our center, the teaching of contemplation is the underlying epistemology. It's what we begin with. It's what we begin everything with. We don't want to teach people what to see. We want to teach people how to see. What do you think the invitation is in our time? This is a huge question. But what do you think the invitation is in our time to recapture that kind of seeing for Christianity, but also for each and every person listening to this podcast?
That's such a good question. Richard calls it in the chapter participative seeing. So it's an embodied seeing. It's a seeing with our feet on the ground, knowing that as a human, I'm made of earth and that I am a creature. And it's a reminder that, as Richard says also in this chapter, contemplation is a gift I can ask for. And then he says that it's a matter of surrendering, not achieving. And I think it's interesting because in that quote you just gave from Jung, who, yes, we share huge love for, he mentioned something about proving, not something to be proved. And surrender is actually to give back and over. So in other words, to give up, like the stripping away and the accepting. But achieve is very interesting because achieve has a head in it. One of the roots of the word achieve is head. And it's something we do with our heads. Like I think, okay, I can do this. I can define this. I can explain it. Mike, you like to say this. It's experiencing, not explaining. But achieving is something I can explain. So I think this contemplative vision is so much more relaxing, even in the middle of, because I have to tell you, as a child, there was so much chaos in my childhood. And in the middle of that, there were these moments of me memorizing Bible verses that turned into being Lectio. There was me experiencing these moments of calm in amongst these times of chaos and real violence and concern for example, will we all be alive tomorrow? And as we deal with, Brian's just written the book Life After Doom, as we deal with ecological overshoot and hurricanes and so many concerns, a person with empathy will be worried about all these things, right? All around the world, the wars. And I think to be a loving presence in the world and to try to, in some small way, alleviate someone's pain and have compassion for myself is this participative seeing. Because then I think, when I see an egret fly over, you're my sibling. Okay, so can I just geek out for a minute with you two? I just have to tell you. So when I know I'm going to meet with y'all and I look up a word, I think, I might get a chance to share this with Mike and Paul. So recently I just learned, can you believe, life is so full of these wonderful joys throughout your whole life, that sibling and self share the same root.
Oh, cool.
So like they both mean self. So like my sibling is my other self. And so the way Francis says, you have, as I always think of it, I think sister, sun, and brother moon.
Yeah.
But however he actually said it in the reverse, but we're all siblings. And I think that's what the contemplative seeing is seeing this Indra's net of I'm attached to everyone. So I'm not separate and scared. I'm attached and in relationship with everyone and everything, even the stones.
Carmen, talking about the pain of your childhood, talking about the overwhelming amount of crises that we see around the world right now. Wars are raging. We are in ecological crisis. Folks are being battered by hurricanes. And we could go on. And yet, we see beauty in the egrets and in the ducks and in the moments of just beautiful humanity that pass us on the street. But this seeing is not putting on rose-colored glasses, right? And I think that's where the disconnect lands for some people. It's not choosing not to see the hurt of the world. It's choosing to see that and have a broad enough vision to see love in the midst of it as well. I'd love to hear from both of you, Paul, you as well. How do you practice that? How do you open your eyes wide enough to see all the hurt and also all the healing and all the loss and all the love?
What I appreciate about this chapter, and I'm glad you brought this up, Mike, is that Richard really deals with that in this chapter 5. He says one of the things we need to do is gaze on the cross and let it return Jesus and love to us. And he gives us 3 steps. He says we have to face feeling forsaken. So one of my difficulties for the longest time she's told me I can share this, so between my mother and me, was I would say to her, Mother, I need to just say sometimes, my favorite prayer from the Bible is Jesus on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you forsaken us? What is going on? And at first she would be like, that's a bridge too far. But I would say, Mother, I find such comfort in that. So I think first of all is just being able to say, my heart is broken. This isn't right. I mean, as a child, I would say to God, I'm a good kid. I'm doing my best. Why do we have this horror in my family with people I love? And I never got an answer. Do you understand? Like last night I heard Anne Lamott say, about Juliana Norwich says, all will be well and all will be well, all manner of things will be well. And Anne Lamott said, yeah, right. like that's not always true. And there's that. And then Richard says, you pray, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So there's the element of how do I deal with this with forgiveness? And that's a complex subject, right? And then the last one is into your hands I give my spirit. So for me, there's I've heard this term before. I don't know that I like it that much, but I know it's used a lot, the bypassing thing. It's about saying, this smells. this is horrible, this is criminal, what do we do? This is a mess, I don't know what to do. But then being met, I so trust the third way now. You know, the third way, the way that I don't have in mind how to fix it. I spent so many years fixing things in my mind, like, oh, if I could just do this, and now I just go, what do I do? That's my favorite prayer. What do I do?
Wow, that's mighty. Thank you, Carmen. I love that passage too, of what Richard shares in the book, those 3 points, and the invitation to internalize the message of the crucifixion. And so we see out with those crucified eyes. Like when I look at my kids and just the fragility of them in this world, and they're still in this phase of like a lot of just unguarded joy with everything. My son just had a birthday this week. And so like everything was like turned to 11, you know, it didn't matter what it was. And like, you can't help but fall into that participative joy. And I feel like that is the contemplative invitation, regardless of what's going on in the world. And that doesn't mean it's like, it's cheap or shallow. You know, I think about Simone Weil's line about in the beauty of the world, brute necessity becomes an object of love. And just the way that the world can be very brutal, and then that beauty is a necessity, and that it helps us formulate our own sense of relationality to love that helps us get through. You know, I think about Viktor Frankl, you know, and just the noticings that he had in Man's Search for Meaning that helped propel him. I remember one passage, it's been a while since I've read it, where someone said to him, you walk like a mountaineer. And here they are in this death camp, and somebody says that to me. He took such pride in that they could see his craft from before. So even being surrounded by atrocity, him being recognized for this small thing became an object of this passion of his before became enlarged and inflamed to something you could take pride in, regardless of what's going on around. Again, doesn't dismiss what's happening. And I look for that I say this, I feel like I think about this every day around to look where there's life. Like, where is life happening right now? And it's the egrets, it's the ducks, it's children, it's the changing in seasons, it's friends' smiles. Like, but to pay attention with that fullness of heart is my greatest discipline in a contemplative practice, to show up and constantly be saying, Lord have mercy, because I don't know what else to say when I behold the largeness of the beauty or of the brutality. Yeah. Mike, how about you? How does that land for you with your own question?
Oh, man, you know, I wasn't prepared to answer my own question. I think the way that it lands for me in this exact moment is 3 things. One, where this podcast is called Everything Belongs, and I always joke and say, like, my most honest question is, if everything belongs, why does it have to hurt so much? And I think that question is the beginning of the reality of it, right? But I also recognize, like, I'm sitting right here with, you know, 3 of my favorite people in the world. Like, Paul, I've learned so much working with you here, and the way you really embody contemplation as a person, as a parent, as a teacher. Carmen, I've learned so much from you as a human, as a person truly walking your healer's journey, as a scholar, as a fellow dyslexic person who's like seeing the world differently, open your eyes in a different way, and reminding listeners, like Corey's here with us as well. And Corey, someone who has walked his own, I would say, truly heroic journey in finding meaning and like living into his true identity, irregardless of what the world would ask of him. Instead, like recognizing who he is and what he has to give in his own unique way. And the quintessential example of someone in the background silently making all this happen, right?
So true.
And so like the gift of the glorious revelation of the divine in the humans around me, but also the willingness to watch everyone be nailed to their own cross and like carry their own struggles and suffering. like I've seen all of you face really difficult challenges in the last little bit. So I think I don't know, man, it's an open-ended question for me. I think the struggle makes the beauty that much more beautiful. But to be very nerdy about it, I have a little limerick I like to say, which is as nerdy as it gets, when I say the only answer to theodicy is theophany. And theodicy is the theological term for the question of, if God is good and love, why do bad things happen? And the theophany is God shows up in the real world. And so the only answer to like, why is life so hard is, I don't know. But it does seem to be there that divine love is made most real. And so all I know is that the practice of trying to hold gratitude and grief and sorrow and celebration together, there's some ramblings of I don't know, but I appreciate the invitation. I think the cross means so much more to me than it used to. It doesn't mean anything at all. It used to be this thing of like, here's what paid the price for your sins. And now here's a reminder that it's really hard to be alive and it's really hard to love, but it's worth it. It's worth paying the price to love. Sorry, there's a ramble. I don't know.
That was beautiful.
I don't know how any of that lands.
Yeah, that'll preach.
No, it was beautiful. And it reminds me, Mike, of how you often say that deep listening is important, is what makes us human, is what we're all trying to do here, right? And wherever we go. And for me, that's where a lot of the beauty of life is too, is in the either being deeply listened to or trying to deeply listen, and some magic that happens that you cannot explain.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting. So this chapter's on contemplation. We had a chapter on mysticism. We talked to our good friend Mirabai Starr about that one. And I found myself last night as I was getting ready for this episode, like wondering, what is the difference between mysticism and contemplation? And I wonder if contemplation is the stance and the view that allows the sort of mystical moments to break in and be possible. But yeah, thanks for that reminder, Carmen. That's been something I've been learning the last 2 years, is that contemplation is deep listening and not deep ignoring, right? It's closing our mouths so we learn how to speak, getting into quiet so we learn how to listen, closing our eyes so we learn how to see, getting still so we learn how to take action. Yeah, and you've really helped me learn a lot of that in the last 2 years of working with you. And you too, Paul. And you too, Corey. What a gift.
I would love to expand further on that question to tee up your sense of this, Carmen, where, oftentimes contemplation gets put on the cushion. Like, contemplation is what happens when you sit in meditation or contemplative prayer. And of course, that's true. But how would you also invite others to lean into the contemplative practices of the tradition, whether it's the prayer of the heart, Lectio Divina, but also being ambassadors who are pushing the boundaries of what it means to join in this participative scene called contemplation? So how would you encourage those listening who say, I don't have time, or like, I have these kind of traditional ways of practicing contemplation, but are also maybe pushing the boundaries in their daily life of thinking of it as, like you were saying earlier, dancing with the trees, or having a mantra that came from a place that wasn't necessarily the sanctioned way we think of sacred texts coming from. What would you invite listeners into that kind of space to explore?
I would invite them to explore. Just you worded that so beautifully, Paul, because one of my favorite parts of the cloud of unknowing is that he says, just try. He says, and as you try this contemplation, you will discover that God is your teacher, and God can teach you far better than I can. And so, in other words, what he does in the cloud is he says, because he's an experienced contemplative, and he says, this is what works for me, these strategies. You try them. If they work for you, great. If you find something else that you try works better for you, come back and tell me, he said, because I'm certain that you can teach me more than I can teach you. And that's a true teacher. But what I love about it is that there's a personalization of the experience, and an invitation to experiment. So there's not a method that we will lock into and forever have the way to contemplation the rest of our lives. There are ways to practice that are time-tested and work, but it's like any relationship. You can find out the principles of good relationships, but when you're in a relationship, it's very personal, and you've got to figure it out as you go, right? I mean, it's the same dynamic. So I would say one of my favorite prayers, because I used to think I was doing everything wrong, because I learned contemplation as a child, trying to make my way through difficulties. And I do and have sat. I've done all the traditional things, centering, prayer, everything, still do. But I, for the longest time, didn't realize that also walking counted. you know, like praying the Jesus prayer, walking counted. Walking with Bible verses on a 3x5 card counted, and was even Lectio Divina before I had the words for Lectio Divina. So one of my favorite prayers is, what should I do? How should I do it? What do I need? So I'm full of mostly questions on this. And then, thank you for helping me. That worked for me. Thank you for that. So for me, it's mostly about dialogue, but then also like washing dishes. Brother Lawrence is so good at this. He says, just try to, and Richard's talked about this, but Brother Lawrence says, just try to return to God this is his definition. Just try to return to love to God as often as you can throughout the day. And he says, when you forget, no big deal, NBD, just return. Just return when you can. So it's not that feeling that I grew up with, that if you missed church on Wednesday night, somebody called you and they were saying, where were you? It's not like God is saying, it's not admonishment of any sort. It's just like you turn up and God's like, great. It's like if I haven't called my mother for a few days, she might send me a text, how's it going? And then when I call her, she's like, oh, it's so good to talk with you. It's not that notion of, you haven't called me in so many days. It's like God's excited you're back. Like God never left, and you never left really quite. There's just that notion, that illusion of separation because you weren't paying attention. So that's what I would say, because Brother Lawrence says, whatever you're doing, whether it's washing dishes or flipping an omelet in the pan, or as I like to think of it, answering emails, because that's my bête noire, is like work emails, you get so many and such, is trying to be very mindful about that. And also like small things like, what meme can I add to my course that will make students feel cheerful? So that's also contemplation. So definitely I would say find the ones that have worked for others, read all about it that you can, and then ask God, what would work for me? What is it? Wait, walking works. Okay, that works too. Yeah.
I love the permission in that. Because first of all, like one of the things I've learned from our conversations, Carmen, is that everyone is already a contemplative. They just don't know it. So to figure out what's natural for you and like the thing you already lean towards, it might be a sitting practice, it might be walking, it might be reading deeply, but to just lean into that and trust it. And then I when I was a living school student, one of my classmates was a Zen teacher, and like a real like lineaged, had gone through all the trainings, and in the lineage that could trace themselves all the way back to the Buddha. And she and I would talk about Zen, and she was a very, very beautiful tutor for a bit for me. And I remember she told me once, I'll never forget this. She said, "Look, Zen is just being present in the moment. That's all, being fully present to what is." She said, "This is Zen." But she said, but then sometimes you lose that and you're not present in the moment. And so Zen is just noticing that you've lost it and just coming back. And that's all Zen is noticing and coming back and noticing and coming back. So it's being present. Sometimes you lose that. Being present is Zen. Noticing and coming back is also Zen. And then she said the highest teaching is when you realize that even the losing it is Zen, because everything is Zen. And I feel like in the world and the conversational universe that we're in, do you think the same thing is true of Christianity and spiritual practice, right? Like it's all practice? Does that feel true?
Yeah, because isn't this the Ammas and the Abbas of making the outside and the inside one. And in the Gospel of Thomas, where, talks about the bowls outside and inside. Sometimes when I'm washing a bowl, and I am very careful because I like bowls outsides to be washed just as well as their insides, so they're not gritty with soup or something. And I sometimes when I'm doing it have my mind blown a moment because I'm thinking, am I washing the outside, the inside? They're the same, boom, and you have that moment where you realize that it's all just one. And so, yeah, you said it beautifully, Mike. I totally agree.
Wow. What a note to end on. Your practice is your practice, so keep practicing wherever you're finding that in the tradition and at the edge of it. That's marvelous, Carmen. Thank you so much for your time today. And Mike, you as well, of course. It's a joy to be in this conversation. And as we continue to walk through Eager to Love and all its permeations and growing edges that we're finding.
Oh my gosh, what a gift.
I love it. Thank you both, Paul, Mike. I love y'all both so much. Thank you.
Oh,
we love you.
Right back at you. Thanks for being a good teacher and a good friend.
Amen.
My gosh, Paul, how amazing is it always to talk to Carmen?
It's the best. I feel like not only do I learn new things about her, but I also learn new things about the contemplative tradition and practices that I had considered, or I see them from a completely different angle because she's pulled out the meaning of a word that I thought I knew. Yeah. And I do know, but she's found the root word that has exploded it into a different direction that helps me to see with bigger eyes.
It's so good. I one fun little personal anecdote that we can throw into the conversation is being friends with Carmen. She loves to send notes in the mail. And so one of the favorite pieces of snail mail I've gotten in the last few months was just this tiny little card. We're talking about not getting too hammered into there being a right way to do contemplative practice. Carmen sent me this tiny little note, and it was a saying from the desert fathers and mothers early in the Christian tradition, these beautiful ascetics who went out and lived in the deserts of Egypt and Syria and the surrounding area. This is what it says. Abba Macarius was asked, "How should we pray?" The old man said, "You don't need long-windedness. Just reach out to love and say, 'Love as you wish and as you know, grant me self-compassion.' Or just, 'Love, help.'"
Wow. That's a lovely, lovely note to consider.
Like, I feel like this exudes who Carmen is, as the sort of just the simplicity of love, help, of approaching contemplative practice as what's right today, what's already working, where am I already a contemplative, and where's it showing up in my life?
Yeah. Those invitations to look at the reality, the conditions of your own life, and I think, as you said, Carmen exudes that part just from her own experience, but who she's translated and how they are friends that live through her. And that's how she invites everyone, I feel like, into a contemplative way of seeing is look what my friends are up to. They're no different than you. They just have books that are a little bit older, and she's translated them for the benefit of all. And how does contemplation and practices show up in your life? Yeah, that seems to be a major theme that runs through our conversation with Carmen.
So good. I feel like, Paul, that might be a good question to leave our listeners to sit with between now and the next episode. How would you phrase that?
Where in your own life are you finding moments, snippets, stances of contemplation? Whether it's in traditional ways or emerging ways or things that feel at the edge of the boundary of what you would be comfortable calling contemplation. Where in your life are you finding contemplative moments?
What a great note to go out on. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to this podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation. an educational nonprofit that introduces seekers to the contemplative Christian path of transformation. To learn more about our work, visit us at cac.org. Everything Belongs is made possible thanks to the generosity of our supporters and the shared work of
Mike Petrow,
Paul Swanson,
Drew Jackson,
Jenna Kuiper,
Izzy Spitz,
Megan Hare,
Sarah Palmer,
Dorothy Abrams,
Brandon Strange,
and me, Corey Wayne. The music you hear is composed and provided by our friends Hammock. And we'd also like to thank Sound On Studios for all of their work in post-production. From the high desert of New Mexico, we wish you peace and every good.
Do you feel called to walk a more contemplative path? The Center for Action and Contemplation is an educational nonprofit supporting the journey of inner transformation. Our programs and resources will help grow your consciousness, deepen your prayer practice, and strengthen your compassionate engagement with the world. Learn more about our resources, such as publications, podcasts, email series, and events at www.cac.org.